reality, but rather that these were was a shadow play on the wall. And he notices also that up here at the top there's a light that's coming in. It's sort of off in the distance and diffused, and becomes curious and goes up there, this long, winding, sort of arduous ascent towards this luminous point, this light point. And upon exiting, finds that outside of the cave there's a whole other world. He's completely blinded by the light, and once his eyes adjust to the light, he sees things as they are. He sees actual trees, actual animals and flowers and so on and so forth there. And it's a world of openness and of freedom and luminosity and three-dimensionality. So we see set up here already in this narrative, before we even delve into sort of its meaning, that there are two spaces that are being used: the cavernous interior space, which is low and it's dark here; this other space that's higher up, right, that you have to clamber over this difficult path, stumbling over boulders in the darkness. You can imagine sort of clambering up this very difficult ascent towards the lighter outside world. So you have these two different planes, a higher one and a lower one. And this idea of high and low is signifying something positive, right? Is an image that we use in language all the time. We are moving up in the world. That's a good thing. We put somebody up on a pedestal, or we look up to someone. This idea of upness is a good thing. When somebody wins the gold medal at the Olympics, they stand on the highest little platform, right? So up is good, and a little bit lower is a little bit worse, and a little bit lower is even a little bit worse than that. So there's this correlation that we're building between a hierarchy. These are just spatial things, and we take it so for granted that we don't even question why it is. But why is upness good somehow? Why is there a positive connotation to being higher rather than lower? And the key to this, in part, comes to us when we examine the difference between this here specimen. This example that I'm using here is Michelangelo's David, of course, and we compare this to this specimen here. This is a beautiful drawing by Albrecht Dürer of a rhinoceros. And what's the big difference between these two? One of them is upright and vertical. The other one is horizontal. So there's this idea that there's an inherent posture to the body that's symbolic. And if we think of ourselves as many early people started to do, pondering our place in the cosmos, wondering how we are different from other animals around us with whom we share many things. We share a body, we share limbs, we share internal organs, hearts and eyeballs and all the rest, just like other mammals, that there is one inherent difference between us and them, and that has to do with our ability to think, right? So for Aristotle, the idea of man as rational animal becomes very significant, and this seat of reason, the place where the things take place that make us very different than all these other creatures around us, happen here at the apex, at the highest point of our body. So we're able to speak through our mouth, we're able to think in our mind, and through reason, through imagination, build up an entire culture, an entire civilization that has the rule of law and order and progress and buildings and art and so on and so forth, language, of course, religion, stories, etc., all coming from our intellect, from our imagination. The other thing that makes us quite different from this creature right here is our ability for moral action. So if you're out in the African savannah and you are stampeded by a group of rhinoceroses, we don't say of those rhinoceroses that they're committing some grave evil or something like this. They're just simply defending their turf, or they're feeling threatened, or their children are in peril. So they're acting upon instinct. And this idea of moral action, which classically has found its seat symbolically in the heart, is also situated higher, right? So the head, the seat of knowledge, the heart, the seat of of moral action, right? This idea that if someone's generous, they have a big heart. Or in Valentine's Day, we send hearts all around because it's the symbol of love, right? That these two centers that are the very things that make us different from all these other animals reside higher than, say, the gut, right? We need to eat to live, or the reproductive organs. We need to reproduce for the species to survive. These are good things, but they are common to all animals, including this one. So this animal exists on a horizontal plane in which head and heart and gut and genitals are all aligned perfectly horizontally, not in any kind of hierarchical structure, but rather the things that dominate our behavior and should sort of move us and command our actions are seated higher. So this idea of a hierarchy of importance is manifest and embodied within the human body in and of itself. So this idea of being upright, this notion that we have again in language, many expressions like being morally upright, is something that we say, or upholding the law, or even in common speech being a stand-up guy. All these things mean being righteous, right? And they depend, this image that we have in language depends on verticality. So this verticality that we see here in this gentleman, mimicked by this here column. Columns are in themselves anthropomorphic. They represent human beings. They have a capital, which is a caput from the Latin head, so they have an actual head. They have a base, which is a foot from the Greek. So being a pillar of society or upholding the law has also to do with this vertical posture that is singularly present in this way in beings that can have moral uprightness, right? This verticality becomes symbolically important not only in these images that we're seeing, but also in images that we use in language itself. So here is a capital which has actually a head carved into it, so this synonymous relationship between humanness and the capital visible here. Further proof of the anthropomorphic nature of the classical column. We have these pillars that are fully anthropomorphized, right, from the Porch of Maidens at the Acropolis in Greece. These are upholding the structure. In this case here, we have the apostles painted on these columns. So these are pillars of the church, right, upon which everything else is built. So this idea of verticality is something, and structural solidity is something that we equate with moral integrity. So when we look at an image like this, we can start to discern what's going on in this painting, even before perhaps we know the story of it. And we'll get to that in a minute. But what we see readily is that you have all these people sprawled out on the ground here. And to many, upon asking them for the first time, they say they look dead. So they're sort of bloated. They're immobile. They're laying on the ground. And this is a painting by Bruegel, which is entitled The Land of Cockaigne, which is a medieval northern myth about sort of arriving at this land of plenty where food and drink are provided in plentiful amounts without having to do anything for it. To get there, you eat your way through a cloud of pudding, which is what this guy over here is doing, and you arrive and essentially you've had it made. So Bruegel is not only representing this scene, but by the time he is working in the Renaissance, a few centuries later, the Netherlands had arrived to become a very flourishing port. So a lot of commerce was taking place, a lot of wealth was being accumulated, and there was a culture of overindulgence. So we have here spread out throughout the painting also things to eat. All throughout, sort of this cooked bird here and a sausage. There's an egg down here. There's some sort of giant donut and so on the table. This is a bunch of platters of food or pies or something like this. And these guys have eaten themselves into a stupor. So when we think back on this idea of verticality and the intrinsic structure, hierarchical structure of the human body, where the head resides in its highest place. It should dominate our action along with the heart. These guys actually upset that balance and put their gut above their head, and thus reduce themselves to this horizontality that every mere beast would have in this situation. So we can understand not only verticality as having a metaphorical meaning, so the way that we carry ourselves in space, this idea of a spatial metaphor, but horizontality as having another meaning, namely in this case being as though dead. So when you're dead, you're laid out horizontally and you're buried in the earth. And so these people are essentially morally dead by putting their flesh, the needs of the flesh, on par with or above and beyond the restraint possible if they were to listen to their reason and their moral center on these matters. So the idea of this fundamental experience of standing upon the earth but dwelling sort of under the sky is something that really has a strong influence over the way that we think about things. This idea of perceiving this horizontal plane upon which we stand vertically as having some part of us that is striving upwards towards something higher, towards something which is above, that we can connect to, is another part of this meaning. So the head isn't the only thing that's above. What's above that, of course, is the heavens. So you can see these spheres above, sort of indicating the trajectory of the sun, which seems to defy gravity, right? It comes up from the earth, dwells in the sky, and then recedes. The moon doing the same. The clouds that sort of float by on a breeze seem to defy gravity. The stars that hang from the heavens. So up there, whatever's up there, is immaterial. It's not bound by materiality. It's not limited by the gravity that would pull any material asunder if you were to hold it and drop it down onto the ground. Hopefully this still works. So this idea of there being an immaterial realm above, one towards which the head and the heart aspire, away from this realm of the earth, which has gravity and which is the realm of matter, is in fact this mind and body dualism, the spirit versus material that is at the core of our human experience. So back to Plato's allegory of the cave, these guys here are within the cave. They're encased within stone, interred within the earth. They're buried, essentially. They're of the earth. And out here, what we have instead is this luminous realm that is of light. It is of these sky-bound things, this higher realm. So for Plato, what he was after with this allegory was to depict, on the one hand, not only this place in which we as human beings dwell, but more specifically to depict it as cavernous and as imprisonment. So we are actually, for Plato, imprisoned by material. We are deceived by matter. And the only way to understand the truth about things, so this is about finding reality, finding the truth about things, is to break free from this imprisonment within the stone and arrive at the realm of Platonic ideal forms where the real thing exists, not just some pale, shadowy representation of that thing within the world. So in this realm of ideal forms, you have perfect geometric shapes. So if you think of a circle, no matter how great your compass is and how sharp your pencil is, in the physical world, no perfect circle can exist. Because the definition of circularity, of course, is that every point on the circumference is exactly equidistant from the center point. But that compass line has a myriad of points on it that are made up of these particles of graphite coming off the pencil, and they're not all exactly equally distant from that center, but rather are within a margin of error. Or if we think of any number of things that we might see as optical illusions, perspective, if you know anything about perspective, lines, we've all seen this on a train track or a road that seem to converge off in the distance. But these lines, as we know, are actually parallel lines. So if you take a measuring tape, the tracks are always 3.5 feet apart, no matter how far down you go. So parallel lines never actually meet, but we will never perceive it like that. We will always perceive it as though they were meeting. So we're deceived by our senses, and matter itself corrupts things and presents us with something that is not the actual reality itself in its ideal form, but rather some shortcoming of that. So this is about seeking truth, about seeking knowledge, and he's using a spatial metaphor in order to describe this. And we have here a couple examples of this in the work of Michelangelo. These are a few works of a series. These are entitled The Prisoners or The Captives. And you can see here that they are also encased in stone, right? So these figures were thought to be unfinished, but many scholars maintain that while he started out the idea of finishing these in a more complete way, these were left this way intentionally because this idea of encasing or leaving within the stone the body was important. It was synonymous with this notion of being trapped within Plato's cave. And in the case of this one, you can even see how the head itself is still encased in stone and being dragged down, right? So instead of being able to strive upwards towards the heaven, towards this immaterial realm of thought and knowledge and the spirit, it is being dragged down and pulled down by this quintessential material stone of which all of the earth is made, which has extreme weight and would drag anything down with it. So we can understand this metaphor being extended here to these figures that are writhing and struggling to free themselves, just like the figures in the cave are struggling to free themselves from the shackles of the material world. So this is our inner turmoil. Every one of us has some struggle that relates to this, right? This dualism, this dichotomy between the mind and the body, between knowledge and ignorance. Even the pursuit of knowledge is very toilsome and a labor from which we can stumble back and fall and rise again and forget things that we knew and so on and so forth and be in this ongoing struggle. The other part of this, of course, of this metaphor is not only the space, so the higher and the lower, the open versus the encased, but rather also the luminous versus the dark, right? So this idea of light being very important. And we use all kinds of images in language, again, also to denote the connection between light and knowledge. So if you think of the idea of enlightenment, right, somebody who is shedding light on something or being in the dark about something means you just don't know about it. Things like when somebody's explaining something and you say, I see, that means I understand. But seeing is predicated upon or contingent upon there being light by which you can see, and darkness, of course, the lack of light, which leaves you utterly confused and dumbfounded and without knowledge. So the luminosity here also very, very important. So this idea of light is something that should be looked at also in painting. So I have a couple of images here. We have this image by Leonardo da Vinci, which is St. John the Baptist. And St. John the Baptist is always recognizable by his little fur toga here that he has, these sort of animal hides, and his spindly little wooden cross. And what is he doing? He's pointing upward, right? He's pointing towards the heaven. We know what upness means, and within the Christian tradition, in fact, many traditions, up is where the divine resides. And he's also illuminated from above, but not just from above and in front. So John the Baptist was this figure that was on the threshold between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He was the one who was given the task to herald the advent of Christ. So he's proclaiming Christ's coming, and here he's doing this by pointing up and by residing here on the threshold between the darkness which lies behind him, this age of shadow in which people were still trying to find their way and bit by bit gaining more knowledge through revelation, and this realm in front of him, which is this luminous realm. Enter Christ, the light of the world. So we see here another image by Michelangelo, which we can use to further some of these points, as well as gain another insight into the use of space in a metaphorical sense, one that we can see in common language as well. So what we have here is, on the one hand, this hierarchical structure, right? You have the Christ child above. You have the Holy Family, so Mary and Joseph on this plateau right here. So there's already an intrinsic hierarchical structure to the placement of these figures. But then in the back here you have this little guy with a fur toga and a little spindly stick. John the Baptist, again, recognizable by his iconographic images, standing on the threshold here of this little wall. Deeper down yet, he's lower yet. So there are these 3 steps, 3 tiers. And within that, also back here, you have these other figures that are standing in this moat, so to speak. And there's a moat between them and the Holy Family. So who are these people back here? These are natural men. These are the nudes reminiscent of Greek sculpture that was being studied extensively in the Renaissance. So you have these figures in the background that are figures that lived in the past. So background is past. This idea of in-between, sort of on a threshold, being a temporal thing in between the old age and the new age. And here in the foreground, this idea of Christ entering the world and bringing on a whole new age for humanity, for the world. So this idea of background and foreground is also metaphorical. So we have up and down, we have vertical and horizontal. Now we have front and back. And this idea of putting the past behind you, something that we talk about, or the future lies ahead. These are images that we have in language just as well. And they come from the way that we ourselves move through space. So with every step that I take, I'm literally leaving behind me a place that I once was and moving into a place that I will yet be. So there's a physical correlation between the past, where I was, and the future, where I'm going. So the way that we stand in space carries with it metaphorical meanings, and the way that we move through space carries with it also metaphorical meanings. So the past isn't literally behind us, but rather we're making a correlation between a temporal reality and a spatial reality. So it's not random, but rather completely dependent upon this idea of how we ourselves move through space. So one last example of this notion of the body and the mind, sort of here in Michelangelo's creation of Adam. You see this famous image that you've seen before. Adam rising from his horizontal position, coming into verticality, his body encased in the earth, this green swath sort of as backdrop to the body, which was made of clay, right? Made from earth, and to the earth it will return upon dying and decaying and decomposing. And yet the head here, the seat of knowledge, encased in the sky. Just like the Christ child here was also not even upon the earth yet, but rather encased in the sky. So coming down from above. And here Adam's head within the same realm as the divine Godhead. So back to these figures right here, not only are they sprawled out, bloated, overindulged moral corpses, they're also orchestrated not only in this horizontal manner, but in another way. So if you look very carefully at this composition, you'll see that they essentially, like spokes, revolve around this central point right here. So their whole entire existence revolves around, in this case, eating. So the composition of surrounding or being around is the same type of image that we use in language as well, where something like a wheel revolves around something else. And in this case, their whole lives revolve around eating at this banquet table that is hanging from the tree there. So this was a composition that Bruegel liked quite a bit, this idea of working, of revolving around. Here's another one of his paintings, and you can see some interesting things going on here. Does anybody know what this painting is about? If you look really carefully, can you discern any noteworthy activity in this? Yeah. Jesus is carrying the cross. Hard to see. Here he is right here. Here's the cross, and there's Christ carrying the cross. And the reason why you can make this out, in part, has to do with the composition and how it's laid out. But the other most obvious component of this is this right here. It's a windmill, and it's precariously perched on this rock. And the idea of the windmill is important to this painting. It's symbolic of God, the miller in the sky, right? So it's positioned here within the sky. And the very composition here down in the earth also revolves around this, like the windmills, sails, or whatever you want to call them, come out. So you can discern within this line of horsemen that points in towards the cross, this landscape right here that points in, the tree, of course, coming down, this landmass over here, the orchestration of some of these figures down here. So you have a very masterfully hidden wheel with spokes surrounding this epicenter of Christ carrying the cross, being related to the miller up here, whose blades are turning in the wind, and he's grinding the wheat into flour to make bread. Christ here being ground into the earth, so to speak, as the bread of life by this churning activity of the people, many of whom are not even paying attention. But the whole entire world here revolves around this mystery of Christ, the bread of life, sort of being ground down into the earth in his suffering on his way to Calvary, where he will undergo horrible torture and death on the cross. So these are some of the images, this idea of upness and downness, this idea of front and back, this idea of verticality and horizontality, that are images, as we see, that we can use to understand art. They're also very commonplace within language. We take them for granted, but they have their roots in some of the ways that we perceive things. So back to this notion of the world as being a horizontal plane. This is not the reality of the world. We've known for a long time that the world is round, and that the sunrise, for example, is given by the fact that the earth rotates instead of by the fact that the sun actually rises itself. And yet we'll never change it to a name like the Earth's rotation phenomenon or something like this. It will always be the sunrise, because our perception is so strong that this horizontal plane is horizontal, that we live on a flat world, and that this sun is rising and setting. And within that sort of perception versus a quantifiable, measurable, empirically provable world of science, that world of perception is where we derive many metaphors from, ones which, as I hope in some small way we've been able to demonstrate, is part of the very way in which we think about the world in which we live. So one of the things that I was thinking about with this work of art that I completed a little over a year ago was this very notion of upwardness and downwardness. That for Christ dying on the cross, it wasn't just a matter of getting nailed there and staying there until he died, but rather that a person crucified is actually dying of asphyxiation under their own weight. So this notion of being pulled asunder, being pulled downward, it was very important to this. And that in order to survive, the crucified has to be able to push themselves up. So on that little block that is placed below the feet to sort of prolong this grueling task, they push themselves up with every breath to be able to take a breath so that they're not asphyxiating under their own weight. So this idea of pulling downward and resisting this downward pull as a means of survival, very important to this piece. But then, as we know, he gets taken down from the cross upon death. He gets buried in the earth, in the stone, and resurrects from the stone. So he is able to overcome gravity. He's able to overcome these powers that would pull him down, that would bury him and smite him in this cavernous prison, which is death. And the images here are not just ones that we think up. They're not just things that we've cooked up over the years and that have become entrenched in our speech and in our images. But these are rather images that are also used by God himself to convey things. So upon the resurrection and then the ascension into heaven, he doesn't just snap his fingers or disappear or walk off into the sunset. He could have chosen any number of different ways of making his grand departure, but he chooses to be elevated up, to defy gravity, to be pulled up into the heavens, into this realm of immateriality. So it's important for us to start looking at these things not only as a way of understanding art, but also as a way of, through this perception that sometimes flies in the face of scientific measurement, be able to understand that part of nature which God himself deems as a way in which he can communicate with us. So the rising sun related to the resurrection. The church, the nave of the church, the ship of the church, this vessel of salvation, pointing towards the east, sailing and bringing with it all of the cosmos into communion with this rising sun, which is synonymous with the resurrection and the assumption of Christ into heaven, for he himself chose those images. So if we can think this way ourselves as beings in the image of and likeness of God, he thinks this way first. He is indeed the supreme artist and poet from whom we have ourselves inherited this way of apprehending things. Thank you very much.